Northrop's Freedom Fighter bucked the trend in the West for ever more complicated, heavy, and expensive jet fighters. As such, it sold well to NATO nations and further afield as well. Electronics rapidly became more sophisticated during the 1960s, though, meaning that by the end of the decade, even a low cost fighter was expected to have a radar warning gear, better navigation equipment, and so on. Widespread proliferation of the MiG 21 also had customers asking Northrop for more air to air capability. The F5A had been made possible by the use of the small but very efficient General Electric J85. This motor had been designed for an air-launched decoy, but it proved to be an excellent light fighter engine. The afterburning J85-13 in the F5A produced 4,080 pounds of thrust, but it weighed less than 600 pounds, giving more than twice the thrust-to-mass ratio of a J79. But the issue with having a light but modestly powerful engine in a light airframe was that adding more weight and drag quickly reduced performance. More power was therefore needed to enable the F5 to carry more avionics and improve the thrust available to a pilot in a dogfight with a MiG-21. Fortunately, GE had been hard at work on the J85, and by the late 1960s had come up with an improved -21 version of the motor. This gave 5,000 pounds of force, and by the summer of 1969 it was flying on a modified F5B at Edwards. Because of the new motor, the internal Northrop project to develop a boosted F5 was F5-21. The new engine added an extra stage to the front of the J85 for a total of 9, but it retained the original 21-inch diameter. This added 7 inches to the motor's overall length, and it increased weight by 100 pounds. Use of titanium rather than steel for the rotor blades kept overall weight gain down, so that around 15% greater weight gave 23% more power. Flight testing showed that the new version of the J85 also had lower fuel consumption. Northrop had to modify the F5B's intakes to give the right airflow and pressure to the front of the engine, and they added blow-in doors on the plenum chamber to give enough flow during takeoff. Northrop's self-funded development process was timely, as in the fall of 1969 the Air Force decided to run a competition for another international fighter aircraft, which would be available at a subsidy under the Military Assistance Program. Their current option was the F5A. Northrop's highly advantageous position didn't stop proposals being received from McDonnell Douglas, who offered a simplified F4 Phantom without Sparrow capability, LTV, which proposed an F8 Crusader derivative, and Lockheed, who were still pushing their L1000 Starfighter derivative. Given how well the Freedom Fighter had been received, and the existing installed base of the type, it was little surprise that in November 1970 the Air Force declared the F5-21 the winner. Because a strong name is always good for marketing, and because of the earlier Skoshi Tiger deployment of Freedom Fighters to Vietnam, in 1971 the new aircraft was named Tiger II and designated F5E. Two-seat versions were F5F. Whereas the F5A was a fighter bomber, more optimized for close air support and strike missions, the F5E was regarded by the Air Force as an air superiority fighter with secondary air-to-ground capabilities. Developing the basics demonstrated on a two-seat prototype into a fully fledged combat aircraft required numerous changes to the original design. The longer engines meant that the fuselage had to be lengthened by a foot. Getting more air into the more powerful motors over a larger range of speeds meant widening the fuselage. Frontal area was 14% greater than the Freedom Fighter. The intakes were 60% bigger. The Tiger II also standardized a modification that was present on some Freedom Fighters in the form of auxiliary air intake gills on the rear fuselage sides just aft of the wing trailing edges. The other standard feature was the two-position landing gear used on some F5s as well. The strut could hyperextend for takeoff, raising the nose about 11.5 inches to give a 3-degree nose-up attitude. Because the aircraft was heavier, and it was to be a superior air-to-air fighter with superior dogfighting capabilities to the F5A, a larger wing was designed. Wing area was 186 square feet rather than 170, achieved by the effect of the wider fuselage pushing the wings outboard about 8.5 inches. A larger leading edge extension, nearly 3 times as big as that on the Freedom Fighter, was also incorporated to improve the ability to hold higher angles of attack at low speeds. I assume that this was an aerodynamic lesson adapted from the Cobra. Wing loading was about 71 pounds per square foot at combat weight in the E versus 68 in the A, despite the E being substantially heavier. The widened front fuselage and altered wings in turn led to a more dramatic curvature to the area ruling of the fuselage to manage drag. Greater fuselage volume allowed internal fuel storage to be increased from 3,790 pounds in the Freedom Fighter to 4,360 pounds in the Tiger II. Underneath, the centerline fuselage hardpoint was shifted back so that a 275-gallon fuel tank could be carried without impinging on the nose gear. 275 gallons is about 1,800 pounds, so range was extended by somewhere around 30 to 40% when carrying it. Moving that mass further back also reduced the takeoff roll relative to carrying the same store in the original position. Under-wing fuel tanks could also be carried on the plumbed inboard pylons. Being able to carry a great deal more fuel than the Freedom Fighter, which was limited to just the 150-gallon centerline drop, meant that the Tiger II could patrol for longer and it was able to ferry about 1,500 miles. Combat Air Patrol mission radius was about 600 miles. The E no longer needed tip tanks, and those stations were instead used for sidewinders or similar missiles. A removable in-flight refueling probe could be fitted for those rare international customers with tankers. Widening the fuselage also allowed the speed brakes to be more widely spaced, again improving the ability to carry bulkier stores on the centerline. The brakes would deflect 45 degrees if there was nothing on the centerline pylon, and 30 degrees with a store attached. The brakes automatically synchronized with the horizontal tail to trim the aircraft when the brakes were deployed, in the same way as they did with the Freedom Fighter. F-5Es feature a manually or automatically deployed set of electrically actuated flaps on the leading and trailing edge, which in combination with the leading edge extension enhance low-speed dogfight maneuverability. Flap controls were on the throttle. There were 2 systems depending on how much the customer wanted to spend. One simply automatically selected from one of 3 settings for the flaps and tail when the pilot moved the flap lever. The other automatically selected flap positions across all flight modes. It could be disconnected for cruising so that turbulence didn't cause the system to activate. Another major advantage that the F-5E pilot had in a dogfight over a Freedom Fighter was the gun aiming system. The integrated fire control system used the Pulse Doppler Emerson Electric AN/APQ-153 radar, which had 4 modes of operation: 2 air-to-air target search settings for different ranges, dogfight, which locked onto the closest target and offered ranging and gun queuing, and finally a missile bore sight queuing mode that calculated the engagement envelope of the AIM-9 Sidewinder and gave the pilot directional cues to help him fly into the envelope via the gun sight. The antenna was a small 12 by 16 inch parabolic dish that was gyro stabilized to account for maneuvering. It was connected to a small 5-inch B-scope display in the cockpit. Overall, the Tiger II was 48 feet and 2 inches long with a span of 26 feet and 8 inches. Maximum takeoff weight was 25,380 pounds. Gross weight just under 16,000, and empty it was 9,583. The first flight of the prototype took place on the 11th of August 1972, but the aircraft was grounded from mid-September to December of 72 because of issues with the engine compressor blades. Flying resumed with restrictions on throttle position in place. The prototype didn't have the production fire control system, which would be tested later on a modified F-5A. As you'd expect, relatively little was discovered in the early test flight program. The F-5E was simple and fun to fly. There were some small issues with the speed of landing gear retraction, and the warnings the pilot got about fuel tank state and thus aircraft trim, but otherwise there was only one thing of note. Whereas the Freedom Fighter had been basically spin-resistant, the F-5E could be provoked into a potentially unrecoverable spin if the pilot really tried. A great deal of testing was done, but no airframe improvements were made to alter things. Pilots just needed to be less than totally ham-fisted. Testing continued, with full-featured Tiger IIs joining the fleet of 6 test articles by March 1973. Performance testing showed that the new aircraft could get up to Mach 1.6 at 36,000 feet. Arresting hook trials were also undertaken to demonstrate short-field landing performance. Production got underway pretty quickly because of the successful test program, and foreign customers began to receive aircraft by December 1973. Everything thus far was wonderfully smooth. To support training and type conversion in foreign air arms, Northrop also developed a two-place version of the Tiger II, just as they'd done with the Freedom Fighter. This was the F-5F. One 20mm cannon was removed to save weight, and the fuselage was lengthened behind the pilot to get in another crewman. Although it was still quite a docile aircraft to fly and a good dogfighter in its own right, the change in centre of gravity did make the F-5F rather different to fly, particularly in takeoff and landing. The F-5F had a slightly different AN/APQ-157 radar, and it had two displays, one in each cockpit. The radar was functionally identical to the 153 in the single-seater, though. Numerous small changes were made for various international customers, many of which ended up becoming standard fitment over time. For example, Saudi Arabia needed a stronger wing so that their aircraft could launch Maverick missiles. That also meant that a laser designator was needed. Switzerland wanted anti-skid brakes for obvious reasons. Chaff and flare dispensers were asked for by several customers to complement the radar warning receiver. Again, following the F-5A, a recce version of the aircraft was made available to customers too. This switched from pod-mounted cameras in the original version of this concept to integrated cameras in the fuselage. It retained one of the 20mm cannons, and it could carry other external stores. The idea was to increase the RF-5E's flexibility so that smaller air arms didn't have to compromise too much on weapons-carrying aircraft in order to get tactical recon. Avionics did have to change rather a lot to facilitate the mission, though. An inertial navigation system, radar altimeter, improved environmental control system to keep the camera lenses in optimum range, integrated sensor control computer, and a television for in-cockpit viewing were all added. The Tiger Eye's new nose added 8 inches to the F-5E, and to give more options to users, equipment carried in the nose was on 3 pallets so that they could be switched in and out for different missions if required. Pallet 1 was in the front, and it had an oblique camera at the forward tip of the nose, facing forward and downwards, followed by a panoramic camera and an infrared line scanner, which was usable in the day or at night. Pallets 2 and 3 contained either a panoramic or a left and right oblique camera. With the right combination in those pallets, the aircraft could cover a strip 41 miles wide in a single pass. Camera control was semi-automatic and linked to the inertial navigation system to help make sure that the right area was being recorded. The pilot could see what the cameras were seeing via a video camera with a 6x zoom mounted on the bottom of the fuselage beneath the pilot's feet. The F-5E was a significant sales success. The final aircraft were built in November 1986, by which point 1,399 F-5E, F and RF-5Es had been delivered to customers. Slightly more Tiger IIs were made than Freedom Fighters, of which 1,204 were constructed. In alphabetical order, its users began with Austria, whose Air Force leased some aircraft from Switzerland to fill a gap while they decided on the right 4th-generation platform. Bahrain acquired one squadron in the mid-1980s and deployed that squadron to participate in Desert Storm in 1991. Brazil was a long-term user of the type, buying 36 aircraft in 1974, then a batch of 22E and 4F models from the US aggressor fleet in 1988, followed by a further 80 and 3Fs from Jordan in 2009. Those aircraft are actually still serving in a heavily modernized form. Ethiopia had been a Freedom Fighter customer, and they signed an order for 14 Es and 3 Fs in 1975. Only 8 aircraft were delivered before repeated atrocities following the coup that overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie led to an embargo in 1976. Shortly thereafter, insurgencies began in the provinces of Eritrea, Ogaden, and Tigray, and then those erupted into all-out war. That led the military government of Somalia to invade Ogaden, sparking a war. The Somalis were flying Soviet-supplied MiG-21 MFs and MiG-17s. Their pilots were Soviet-trained. The Ethiopian pilots, for their part, had been trained by the British, the Swedes, and most recently the US. They were well prepared and well motivated, even if their small fleet of Sabres, Freedom Fighters, and Tiger IIs was a little bit threadbare numerically. They also had two Westinghouse ANTPS 43D air search radars for interceptor direction. The MiG-21MF was quite similar to the F-5E in many regards. It was also an advanced version of an austere fighter concept. Like the Tiger II, the MiG-21MF was 48 feet long. Its wingspan was a similar 23.5 feet and wing area was 247 and a bit square feet. That made its wing loading a bit lower than the F5, but not decisively so. The MiG-21's empty weight was nearly 2,000 pounds more than the Tiger II at 11,700 pounds, but maximum weight was lower at just under 21,000 pounds, a result of lower internal fuel capacity. The MiG was faster at Mach 1.8 and it had a higher ceiling, but the usual Soviet ergonomic problems like heavy controls, poor rearward visibility, weak gun sight, limited air-to-air missile options, and slow throttle response made the on-paper numbers much less decisive in the real world. Even so, the war started badly for the Ethiopians when one of the precious F-5Es was shot down with an SA-7 manpads. Their revenge started on the afternoon of July 24, 1977. A pair of MiG-21s attempted to intercept an Ethiopian transport, but they were bounced by a pair of F-5Es. MiG was then down with a sidewinder. The next day, 4 Tiger IIs intercepted a formation of 4 fish beds and 4 frescoes. As soon as the Ethiopians appeared, 2 of the MiG-21s succeeded in colliding and crashing. The Tiger pilots then went after the other fish beds, downing one with cannons and the other with a sidewinder. Falling upon the MiG-17s, they bagged 2 more with AIM-9s and foiled the attack they were attempting. On the 26th, another pair of Tigers engaged a pair of MiGs, again coming out on top. One MiG was damaged by a sidewinder and finished off with cannon fire. 2 more fish beds were downed before the war's end, completing a surprisingly one-sided meeting between the 2 types. As I said, the MiG-21MF was arguably a better aircraft than the Tiger II, being faster and equally good in terms of turning performance at higher altitudes. But better training, better GCI that enabled the Tiger pilots to force engagements at lower medium altitudes and from favourable positions, and the sidewinder appear to have made the difference. Just those few things then. The most successful Ethiopian F-5 pilot was Legesse Tefera, who was credited with no less than 6 confirmed kills. For one, Soviet records align well with the Ethiopian claims, so the chances are that Tefera actually was an ace. Also in Africa, Kenya acquired 10 single-seat and 2 F-model Tigers in 1976, and they still operate them today. Malaysia had 16 aircraft, operated them in the front line until 2015, and apparently still has them in storage. Mexico bought 10 Es and 2 Fs in the early 1980s, and most of those are still in service. Morocco was a freedom fighter operator, then upgraded to Tiger IIs in the late 1970s, and it flies 2 squadrons of them in 2025. Singapore was a dedicated user of the type, going so far as to totally modernise their fleet of 20 or so aircraft with head-up displays, an Italian X-band radar that allowed the use of the Aspeed long-range missile, multifunction displays, and so on. One of the cannons was removed to make room for all of that kit. The deeply upgraded F-5S aircraft were finally retired in 2015. Of course, I've thus far neglected the largest export customer for the F-5E. Iran acquired 127 of the original F-5A and B models in 1964 in a $250 million deal known in the US as Project Peace Enforcer. The Iranians became experienced operators of the F-5, and they built up an industrial and training base to support the aircraft locally. By 1970, they had hundreds of engineers specialized in maintenance of the type, and a new Iranian aircraft industries plant at Mehrabad to do depot maintenance. Later, they'd build a second plant specializing in the J-85 engine. His close affiliation with Northrop meant that the Shah got early sight of the P-530 Cobra concept in the late 1960s. He was very interested in acquiring a production version, but development was slow. The US was also somewhat reluctant to transfer more advanced aircraft than the F-4Ds and F-5As to Iran. The situation changed as the air campaign in Vietnam cooled down, and other countries sought to exploit the vacuuming combat aircraft offered to the Shah with their own offers. The French offered Mirage 3Es, the Soviets MiG-21 MFs. This pushed the US into action, and with the Cobra not yet available, the solution was Peace Rush 1, under which Iran ordered 36 F-5Es in 1971 with an option for another 108. The US also brokered deals for Iran to sell their freedom fighters. 34A and 9B models went to South Vietnam for $362,500 a unit, on the basis that they would be returned when the war ended. Some of them actually did make their way back after having been evacuated from the country as it fell apart. 20 freedom fighters were effectively donated to King Hussein of Jordan in 1975, as were 10A and 2B models sold to South Korea for $106,000 a unit. 8 aircraft went to Ethiopia and 2 to Morocco. The Jordanian aircraft were eventually resold to Greece in the mid-1980s, so the Iranian aircraft definitely got about. Because of their willingness to transfer aircraft to other hotspots at the US government's behest, Iran was at the head of the line when F-5E production examples began to come off the line in 1973. 58 were in service by the end of 1974. Peace Rush 2 added further orders for F-5Es, sufficient to equip 8 squadrons. Iran also signed up for 28 F-5Fs in an advanced specification that included wiring for carriage of ANALQ 101 ECM pods under the wings and GBU-10 laser-guided bombs. The idea was that these aircraft would replace the F-4D fleet during the 1980s in addition to their training role. Although at the start of their career the F-5Es were the hottest ticket in the Iranian Air Force, the arrival of F-4Es and then F-14 Tomcats meant that the best pilots were generally taken out of the F-5E squadrons and flew the higher-end types. Support for the Tiger II continued to improve, though, with a computerized logistics system delivered and installed in the mid-1970s to coordinate deliveries of supplies between bases, depots, and warehouses. Ultimately, the expanding Iranian economy and the desire to create the most powerful military in the region led to the order of 140 F-16 Fighting Falcons in 1977 under a project called Peace Zebra. These would have replaced the F-5Es in combat roles sometime in the 1980s. But, of course, the 1978 revolution caused an immediate cessation of deliveries of spare parts and technical support from Northrop contractors, as well as putting to bed any possibility of F-16 transfers. Purges swept through the F-5E squadrons, leading to the majority of experienced pilots being fired and leaving only the junior pilots and NCOs. Readiness deteriorated very fast, and by 1979 the squadrons were essentially combat ineffective. The obvious issues across the border led to Saddam Hussein spying an opportunity. Cross-border incursions by Iraqi aircraft increased in the summer of 1980, including raids by Su-20 fitters and the spraying of flammable liquids on crops and oil fields by AN-2 biplanes. One of these aircraft was intercepted and damaged by F-5Es in a rare Iranian Air Force sortie. In response, the Iranians launched visual reconnaissance sorties along the border with their Tiger IIs. One of these was promptly shot down with a SAM on the 25th of June 1980. Concerns about Iraq's intentions led to an effort to reinstate elements of the Iranian Air Force command structure and to increase the readiness of Air Force squadrons. But it was too little too late. Cross-border attacks intensified during the first days of September 1980, with Iranian fighters attacking Iraqi army formations as they assembled. 2 F-5Es were lost in these efforts, one to 23mm flak and the other to an SA-6 SAM. The pilot of the former aircraft, Second Lieutenant Hossein Lashkari, ejected and was captured. He spent 18 years in an Iraqi prison. The full-scale Iraqi attack began on September 22, 1980. At this point, Iran still had 115 F-5Es operational in 5 squadrons, plus 1 recon squadron with RF-5As. 40 aircraft were in storage. Arrayed against them was the primarily Soviet-equipped Iraqi Air Force, operating MiG-25 Foxbats at the top end, then MiG-23s as the main fighter bomber, and 9 squadrons of MiG-21 BIS fighters. Mirage F-1EQs were about to arrive from France as the invasion started. The Iraqi plan was to knock out the Iranian Air Force at its bases. 70 single-seat F-5Es and 14 two-seaters were at the TFB-2 base as the first Iraqi strikes began. 4 F-5Es were on quick reaction alert at the base, each armed with their cannons and a pair of AIM-9Js. The Iraqi attacks on TFB-2 began at 1:45 in the afternoon, and they were generally ineffective, having been executed based on relatively poor intelligence and without the kind of specialized anti-runway and anti-structure weapons needed for the task. They did, however, achieve the element of surprise, and the first pair of quick reaction alert aircraft only got airborne 5 minutes after the attack had finished. Their mission ended only a few minutes later, as both aircraft were forced to return to base, their engines having ingested some of the debris strewn across the runways and taxiways. It was an inauspicious start. The other F-5 base, TFB-4, was in a much higher state of readiness. 3 MiG-23s and 2 Su-22s came in and destroyed 3 of the 26 F-5s parked out in the open, and the base's Hawk SAM battery. The second wave came through at 2:20 and had little effect. Damage to the runway was repaired in short order, enabling combat air patrols to get airborne. A large Iranian counterstrike by upwards of 80 F-5Es the next morning bombed hardened shelters at several Iraqi bases. Unfortunately, the Tiger II's vulnerability to SAMs was already very evident. 3 aircraft were lost, one to an SA-3 and the other 2 to an unidentified SAM system. The battle swung between the opposing sides' air bases. On the 23rd, another pair of Iraqi strikes hit TFB-2, the second just as a formation of 20 F-5Es were taking off to attack Al-Hurriya Air Base. Su-22s caught 2 Tigers on their landing roll and shot them both down. A Tiger that was already airborne and laden with a tank and 4 Mark 82 bombs then succeeded in downing a Su-22 with a Sidewinder. The Iranian strike was aborted, but the other wing at TFB-4 did get airborne to attack Ali and Ibn Talib Air Force bases. 6 Tiger IIs were lost in the process, 2 to SAMs. The inexperience of the commanders of the 2 wings, who were political appointees from the new regime, was leading to horrific attrition. MiG-21s and Tigers clashed for the first time on the 24th of September, when 4 Tigers from TFB-2 went back to Al-Hurriya and were bounced by a pair of fish beds. One of the Tigers was slightly damaged by an ATOL, exploding underneath it, but a MiG was then shot down with a Sidewinder in the ensuing melee. Another Tiger was unfortunately lost to a SAM while attempting to strafe parked helicopters at the base, though. The MiG-21 pilots had their revenge in the form of a Tiger that hit a mountainside in a dogfight on the 26th of September while attempting to avoid cannon fire, and another shot down with a Matra Magic launched from a modified fish bed on November the 14th. In between times, at least 1 Su-22 was down by Iranian Tigers on October the 17th. 2 others were also claimed. After the abortive attempts to knock out Iraqi air bases, the F-5 wings shifted their focus to the country's oil infrastructure in early October with some success, albeit losses continued to mount. SAMs and AAA were thickly spread around Iraqi infrastructure. A mission by 8 Tigers to strike Iraqi oil facilities on November the 26th led to a huge air battle, in which a Tiger was shot down with an AA-8 aphid and a MiG fell to cannon fire. Iraqi sources have it that the Iraqi pilot deliberately rammed his Iranian adversary, but that doesn't tally with what their Soviet advisors or the Iranians recorded. 2 Tiger kills appear to have been made by Colonel Mohammed Ryan, nicknamed the Sky Falcon, who would go on to become Iraq's only ace before his own death while flying a MiG-25 against F-14s. After this point in late 1980, air-to-air engagements involving Tigers became rather less frequent. Both sides realized that the other had sufficiently lethal air defenses that sending their low-end aircraft into heavily contested airspace was essentially a suicide mission. By the end of March 1981, 52 F-5Es and 2 F-5Fs had been shot down. One area that the Tigers did contribute to air superiority in was as a low-level guard for F-14s performing high caps. This was in response to a pair of Mirage F-1s sneaking up on a pair of F-14s on the 15th of November 1981 and shooting them both down with Super 530s. Lack of spares began to impact availability of the hard-working F-5 fleet. This led to the Iranians going all over the world to obtain whatever pieces of F-5s they could find. Although regime propaganda would have it that many of these spares were made by ingenious Iranians as part of the Self-Sufficiency Jihad division, in fact, a range of British, Israeli, and US arms dealers facilitated access to some parts. South Korea was a particularly good source, as was Taiwan, although pressure on those countries eventually stopped the flow. In 1985, an Israeli middleman managed to acquire the remainder of Ethiopia's F-5 fleet for $34 million. Having found communism during the Ogaden War, the Ethiopian Air Force had, like Iran, found itself cut off from spare parts and thus unable to maintain its aircraft. The Soviets had stepped in and supplied MiGs to replace them. These 5 F-5Es, 14 As, and 1 RF-5A had low airframe hours, but they were in dreadful condition, lacking basics like their guns and avionics. Even so, they were restored, although not soon enough to take part in the war. Incidentally, the CIA had tried to acquire the aircraft for $7 million, but were comprehensively outbid. Attrition did continue to impact the Tiger fleet, and by the ceasefire in 1988, only around 40 usable aircraft remained, with about the same number in various states of storage. Of the losses, Iraqi pilots claimed 24 victories, with 15 for MiG-21s, 5 by MiG-23s, 3 by Mirage F-1s, and 1 by MiG-25. I think it's sensible to take the total number with a pinch of salt. Iranian F-5 scored 8 kills on either Su-22s or MiG-21s. Their most spectacular success was on the 4th of July 1986, and their victim was a MiG-25 Foxbat. The background to this kill began on the 3rd of June 1985. At this point in the war, the Iraqis were using their MiG-25RB reconnaissance aircraft quite extensively over Iran. Their great speed meant that even the combination of F-14 and AIM-54 was only very rarely able to intercept them. The Iranians therefore took to sortying as many aircraft as they could in an attempt to box in the Foxbats. The Iraqis were neither stupid nor tactically naive. On the 3rd of June, they replaced the RB with a fully armed MiG-25 PD flying the same course as the recon aircraft. This aircraft surprised and shot down an F-5E with a pair of R-40s as the Tiger II climbed to intercept. The Tiger crews swore revenge. Although the MiG-25 was very fast once it got going, when it was low on fuel and cruising home at the end of a mission, it was actually quite sluggish. Just before daybreak on June the 4th, 1986, a MiG-25 tried to intercept an airliner flying across Iran towards Turkey. Too focused on that airliner, and perhaps considering himself invulnerable to attack, the Foxbat pilot fell into a trap. 2 F-5Es scrambled from the TFB-2 base, approached the MiG from below and behind, vectored by GCI. The flight leader, Colonel Mohammed Zia-Najad, climbed up behind the Foxbat in afterburner, with his radar off to prevent detection by the Foxbat's sensitive radar warning gear. He locked on with a pair of AIM-9s, but the missiles malfunctioned and they wouldn't leave the rail. Frustrated, he closed in, firing his cannons and scoring multiple hits, which caused smoke to trail out behind the big interceptor. There was an explosion and it seemed to start to burn, even as its pilot lit his afterburners and turned for home. Iraqi sources have the MiG-25 making it back to base with some 20mm holes in it. Soviet records confirm that the aircraft never flew again after the incident, making it a victory, if perhaps not a kill in the traditional sense. Combat experience in the Iran-Iraq War demonstrated several things about the F-5E. First was that an aircraft with austere avionics could no longer operate safely over a battlefield dominated by 1970s-era surface-to-air missiles. Lack of radar warning receivers with the right frequencies and of chaff and flare dispensers on the Iranian aircraft added to their vulnerability. Low-level attacks were also dangerous over flat terrain, as the F-5's agility was no protection against rapid-fire gun systems. As an air superiority fighter, the F-5 simply lacked the power and thus the speed to keep up with a MiG-23 or a Su-22, particularly at low level. They could also not keep pace with Phantoms in similar circumstances and thus couldn't provide effective escort. As this was a battle between pilots of equal skill, led by equally inept commanders, the difference in performance between the Tiger II and the MiG-21 was less stark. It does have to be remembered that the Tigers were often in strike configuration when they were attacked, and therefore were at some disadvantage. In this case, the MiGs were armed with missiles that were more or less as good as the Sidewinder, and their effectiveness was obvious in the results. On the other side of the coin, the F-5E demonstrated its toughness. Aircraft survived near misses from SA-6s, hits from SA-7s, and gunfire as heavy as 57mm. Having two engines was a major survivability enhancement. Their ability to employ CBU, as well as iron bombs, napalm, rockets, and cannon fire, made them lethally effective against Iraqi armoured columns. By way of example, when attempting to slow advancing Iraqi armour on September 27, 1980, the TFB-4 wing dropped 166,400 pounds of bombs and fired 32,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition in 64 sorties in just one day. On the 28th, they launched 68 sorties, dropping 176,800 pounds of bombs and firing 34,000 shells. 100 Iraqi armoured vehicles were destroyed for the loss of two F-5s, causing the Iraqi formation to break and run, abandoning 24 T-55 and T-62 tanks. Able to sustain higher sortie rates than the heavier F-4 was also of major benefit in the early days of the war before the Iranian Air Force got its act together. Because the Iranians developed an extensive maintenance and repair capability in the country before the revolution, they've also been able to do some fairly impressive projects on what remains of the F-5 fleet. That includes using Chinese electronics to refurbish and then remanufacture some of their own aircraft and some sourced from Vietnam. Hence the PL-7s you'll occasionally see on Iranian Tiger wingtips. There have also been more ambitious projects, such as several twin-tailed Tiger derivatives, claimed to be brand new aircraft but more likely a result of re-engineering hulks obtained from Vietnam or elsewhere. Clever or not, these are essentially 1960s aircraft masquerading as 1990s ones. Ethiopia and Iran's experience with the Tiger II in combat, and the many happy customers around the world, goes some way to demonstrating why the Northrop fighter was such a sales success. It is, however, important to remember that the F-5E's combat experience came after most countries bought the aircraft. Part of the Tiger II's popularity came because it was available to some countries at a discount through the Military Assistance Program. But because it was mass-produced and it had capability cut in the right places for most users, the Tiger II was cheap to start with. Unit cost in the early 1970s was around $2.1 million. A Mirage F1 cost in the region of $3.5 to $4 million, and of course was more expensive to sustain. A Phantom was about $4.2 million and even more expensive to sustain. The pricing of the MiG-21 was in the region of $800,000 a unit by the early 1970s, which is obviously vastly less than either of the Western types. But to get one, you had to at least purport to be some sort of communist or at least an anti-imperialist. A MiG-23MF cost about $1.6 million, but only very good communists or those with useful foreign currency reserves got floggers. The Tiger II also contained basically no cutting-edge systems. It was therefore acceptable to sell it to many countries who were less traditional US allies, or under the Carter administration were deemed to be less than ideal representations of American democratic values. As the 1980s began, though, the Reagan administration brought a rather less puritanical attitude to foreign military sales. If you were against communism and you had hard currency, then you could buy what you wanted. This change of attitude coincided with maturity of the F-16A Fighting Falcon. In some ways, the F-16A was a philosophical successor to the F-5, being lightweight and adopting a sensible attitude to avionic sophistication. It was, however, vastly more capable in all respects than the Tiger II. F-5 sales therefore began to tail off. This was the motivation for the intriguing F-20 Tiger Shark, which is, of course, another story entirely. I hope you've enjoyed this rapid tour through the F-5E. Thanks for watching.